Yeah. I'll put it. Yeah. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Great. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started because we have a packed program and we have an amazing talk from Nimrod. So my name is Sophie Don. I'm the Associate Director of the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. And I'm joined today by Esther Kutash, our foundation's Executive Director, and Nimrod Gornstein, who is our expert speaker, who I'll introduce in just a moment. This program was also made possible with the support from some of our wonderful peer institutions. So thank you to the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center and 3G Philly. So thank you both for partnering on this. In Holocaust education and our programs, we speak very often about the history of the Holocaust and the immediate aftermath. But it's important as well to look to the more recent past and to the present to learn about what has been done and what is currently done to support survivors. Tonight, Nimrod will be focusing on how survivors living in Israel have been compensated by Germany and Israel from 1948 through to the present day. He'll be elaborating on historical, legal, and social contexts, which have created various compensation rates for different groups of survivors, which has set up a hierarchy of survivor experiences. Nimrod will also discuss how the definition of survivor has changed over time, raising important and challenging ethical questions. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A that will be led by Esther. So should you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Now, a little bit about our speaker. Nimrod Gornstein joins us tonight from Israel, where it is very late, so we are so grateful that he is with us. And he is a lawyer and has served as a professional advisor on Holocaust survivor policies for the General Director of the Israeli Ministry for Social Equality. This organization was in charge of compensations and social aid for Israeli Holocaust survivors and diplomatic relations on the subject. He holds degrees in history and law from Tel Aviv University, where he worked with a legal clinic for Holocaust survivors, representing them in bureaucratic compensational procedures. Nimrod studies the impacts of different Holocaust narratives and the hierarchy of sufferings on the legal eligibility for compensations of Israeli Holocaust survivors. And he promotes a needed and urgent change in laws and bureaucracy regarding aid and compensation for the survivors that are still among us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nimrod. And let me just make sure that I can pin you so that everybody can see you. All right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. And hi, everybody. And thank you for joining this conversation, which I hope will be interesting for you. I find this topic of compensations for Holocaust survivors to be fascinating. It's a very complex topic for many reasons, and maybe this should be the first disclaimer about this talk. Now, I've built this talk knowing that most of the people, not only here, but everywhere, are not professionals in understanding this historical and legal material. And for that reason, I'm going to try to explain in a short time of about 40 minutes, 45 minutes without the Q&A, about some key insights that you should know about compensation for Holocaust survivors, at least in Israel. I feel comfortable talking about it in Israel, though, as you know, even also Holocaust survivors outside of Israel got compensations. But in these 45 minutes, we're going to talk, or an hour, we're going to talk more about the Israeli case. So if we're all set to go, I'm just going to share my screen. One moment. Sophie, Esther, can you see my screen? Great. I'm going to put it here. Okay, so let's dive right in.
And we're looking at the notes side of the screen.
Oh, so let's stop share. I'm sorry, and thank you
no
for
worries.
that, Sophie.
The burden of two screens.
Is that better now?
It's okay. Good.
Yeah.
It's the notes screen, but
it's still the notes.
Mhm.
So we're gonna give it one more try. I'm sorry for that.
Yes.
And now?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Great, thank you. So we're just gonna dive right in. So I'm not gonna repeat about myself, but I will only say in this context that I was born in Israel. Though my parents were born in the USSR, they were refuseniks. If you know what that means, that means that they were not let into Israel by the Soviet regime, and the American Jewry helped them get in to Israel in the end of the 70s. And they were the children of survivors from the evacuation, which is a very specific term that we're going to talk about later on. So this is about myself. And now, as Sophie said, I used to work in NGOs, in Holocaust survivors materia, and also LGBTQ materia in Israel. And then I moved to work at the parliament, government, doing these topics. And now I got back to the NGOs, and I do talks about these topics, about the political situation in Israel and other topics. So it's very nice to be with you here. Okay. So what were we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the history of compensations. We're going to talk a little bit about the legal frame. We're going to talk about differences between groups of survivors. We're going to talk about poverty and social services for survivors in Israel. And we're going to end with problems and solution. It's a very ambitious plan. And as that, we're going to make it. And I think it's going to be, I'm not going to hurry up so much. Like if we'll see that we don't have a lot of time, then maybe I'll just keep the least important part of it. Okay. So just to start with, here's a map of 1942 to 1944 in Europe. And all of us can probably imagine how chaotic it was back then, especially for Jews, but not only for Jews, but for everybody. But this is a map that show you the direction in which Jews were led from Europe towards the area of Poland, where all the extermination camps were built. Though, if you see the eastern part of the Soviet Union, and I'm going to talk about it later on, then we know that more than 1.5 million Jews were killed, not in this area, not by leading them to extermination camps, but by murdering them in their local area where they used to live. And this is a very important part of understanding how compensations were built later on, and we're going to talk about it later. So I just wanted to show you a map just to get a general geographical context. And now let's talk about history. So I believe most of you know that in 1948, the state of Israel was established. And then 2 years after, Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, ordered to start secret negotiations for reparations with the West Germany, meaning that without the knowing of the citizens, a delegation of Israelis met with Western German representative to talk about the possibility of compensations for Jews inside Israel, but not only. The talks were also about the Jewish nation as a whole. And then a year after, the German chancellor, like the German president back then, named Adenauer, talks in the Bundestag, which is the German parliament, about the responsibility that the Germans need to take about the Jewish persecution that leads, and he said that for the need for reparations. And that was the first time that the Germans admitted that there's a base that there is a moral basis for them to compensate Jews. And then a few months after, the Ben-Gurion takes the idea or these talks of negotiation with Germany to the Knesset, to the Israeli parliament, and a massive public turmoil bursts in Israeli public. I can tell you that, and I'm sure you know that in the past year or so, there's a very big public turmoil again in Israel. And I've heard a few times referrals to these times when there was an extremely turbulent situation in Israel back in 1952 on the basis of this disagreement. Begin, who was the biggest oppositioner of Ben-Gurion, and later on was also the prime minister of Israel, called for civil disobedience. Okay, so this is how extreme it was for the mere thought of Israel and Jews being compensated by Germans 5 or 6 or 7 years after the end of the war. It was so severe that throughout the debate in the parliament, crowd was standing outside shelling rocks into the parliament, and glass broke, and things that I think up to this year, Israeli history have not been seen. 1952, the Luxembourg Accords, which is basically the document that that frames the agreement of the compensation, and it has two parts. First part is an agreement saying that West Germany, and we're talking only about West Germany, East Germany did not take part in these talks. Germany agreed to pay 3 billion marks for the Israeli government to buy West German goods with it. And this was gave a huge boost for the young country that was in a very big economical crisis and absorbing hundreds of thousands and even millions of Jews from Europe and from Arab and Muslim countries. Another part of the agreement was for the compensation of Jews which are not located in Israel. And at 450 million marks went for international Jewish organizations that represented the survivors which are not in Israel. If you've heard about the Claims Conference, this is the biggest organization that still exists that represent the Jewish survivors outside of Israel, and in a way also inside of Israel. The thing was, and this is the first interesting thing to know about the Luxembourg Accord, is that Israel agreed with West Germany that it will not be able for all the survivors living in Israel up to that date to personally sue Germany for personal damage and compensations. That means that if a survivor after the Holocaust emigrated to America, for example, that in some point he had the opportunity to personally sue Germany to get compensation. But if his friend came to Israel before October of 1943, which is the date that was agreed in the Luxembourg Accord, it means that he lost his right to sue Germany for personal damage. So Israel got compensated instead of personal, it got compensated as a country that hosts the Jewish survivors that got into it, and it did it, and by that, it took the right from personal people to do that. And as you can imagine, the survivors living in Israel back then, when they understood that they lost their right for personal compensation and that the state got compensated instead of them, and nobody asked them whether they are willing to give up their right, they were very upset. So what happened is that this population of survivors living in Israel before the agreement in 1952 that lost their right to claim compensation from Germany started demanding the Israeli government to compensate them instead. And what they did, and I'm going to say that in a moment, that what Israel did is that Israel copied the German law and started compensating people instead of Germany. So just to make it clear, let's go back to the first dot here. And I want to tell you a bit, just in a short sentence, about how Germany decided to compensate. So Germany enacted a law for compensations of Jews. And it said that a person who wants to sue Germany for personal compensation needs to prove where he was, meaning, for example, at a German camp, and it was only in places that were directly under Nazi regimes and not, for example, places that were controlled by its proxies, like Romania, for example, okay? The second thing that this person who wants to sue Germany for compensation needs to prove is time, that he was there in a specific time that is recognized by Germany as a time that is relevant for compensations. And the third and most important part is that he needs to prove current medical damage. So people were not compensated for the fact that they were being in this specific place and time, but they were compensated for their current disabilities that were the result of them being in this location and time. So, for example, if Germany accepted the fact that specific medical conditions were could be the result of a person being 10 years before in a specific camp, then they got 50% disability eligibility, for example, and so on. Now, Germany also put a border on the deadline and a deadline to the last day that survivors can sue. And it said that it's up to 1969. So if a person wanted to sue in 1970, it was no longer a possibility back then. And this is something that it had changed, and I'm going to explain it, but it's something important to know. I hope that I'm going to stop for a moment and see Sophie, Esther, let me know if any corrections, any questions are good.
Okay.
Great. I hope you follow me. Great. So I up to now, I explained that Germany enacted a law with its conditions. But as I said before, Israeli survivors making Aliyah before 1953, they lost their right to sue on this ground. And they became discriminated because Israel got compensated instead. And what happened is that in 1957, to solve this discrimination, Israel copied the German law and made it an Israeli law, meaning that it's from Israeli money, not from German money. And it left the 1969 deadline. So what happened is that between 1969 to 1995, there were no new recognition of survivor. Meaning, if a survivor did not, in Israel, it means that if a survivor did not file for recognition before 1969 for Germany or Israel, then he lost his right to do so. And a lot of Holocaust survivors simply were left with no compensation based on the tragedy that they've been through up until 1995, when Israel reopened the law for survivors who didn't sue Germany in time. And if you think about all the survivors that lived up to 1995 in the Eastern Bloc, then you can understand how many people did not sue up to 1969. If you remember, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc were separated throughout the Cold War. So Jews in the Eastern Bloc did not have the opportunity, the bureaucratic opportunity, to file a lawsuit against Germany, let's say if they lived in Ukraine, in the USSR. So only in 1995, when they came to Israel, they started talking about the possibility of getting compensation. And we're going to talk about this population from the USSR later on. Another population that didn't sue in time was the ideologists, meaning in Israel, you'll find many people, and I'm sure the Jews outside of Israel as well, you'll find many people who simply do not want to receive any money from Germany. And back then, there were people who said, "I'm not gonna sue because that will," in Hebrew you say bleach, like that would decriminalize or the criminals, the criminality of the Germans by paying them like a bribe. And these people also didn't sue. And if they changed their mind, it was only after 1995 that they got the option to do so. So we got to the point that we understand that we already have different groups of survivors, and we have different criterions to receive the compensation. We have the location criteria, the time criteria, the proof of current medical damage. We have the deadline, meaning when did you sue? And we also have when did you came to Israel, that will inflict on the amount of money that you're going to get. And I think that now what I'm going to do is, okay, now what you see is a very big table, and don't get scared of it. But it's a kind of simulation that I've created for you, just to show you just how complex it is to try to understand how much should a survivor in Israel get compensated for. And before we dive into some examples, as theoretical examples, but it's all but there are real people that we can find that went through the process with this info. But before I say that, I say that this material, this historical legal material of compensations for Holocaust survivors is so complex that when I built this table, I needed to phone a friend of mine, which she's also a lawyer, and she's probably among the 5 most knowledgeable lawyers in Israel from the Legal Clinic for Holocaust Survivors in Tel Aviv University. And we started playing with the examples, and we also said, like, we cannot take 100% responsibility for that because it's simply so complex. So it's each case on its own. And think about a Holocaust survivor that needed to try to think just why am I getting a specific amount and my friend gets another amount, and why doesn't the lawyer even manage to explain to me how it is? Well, we do explain, but it doesn't make sense a lot of times. So let's see how it doesn't make sense. So let's take Isaac and try to concentrate on the first line. He made Aliyah. He came to Israel in 1948, just a few years after he got out of the extermination camp in Poland. And because he came in 1948, if you remember the Luxembourg Accords, he lost his eligibility to personally sue for compensation until Israel made it possible by enacting its own law in 1957. So he sued in 1958. He got the right to sue Israel for compensations. But then he needed to prove what kind of medical damage he has. And then what happens is that Israel started to enact like a book of diseases that are recognized for the purpose of compensating Holocaust survivors. So let's say, and I just made up these examples, let's say that nowadays he suffers, or back when he sued, he suffered from diabetes and skin cancer. So, for example, the state can say, okay, people who went through extermination camps, it's very reasonable that they will later on suffer from diabetes, but it's not reasonable that they will suffer for skin cancer. So we will not acknowledge the percentage of disability for the skin cancer, but we'll give you X percentage of disability for the diabetes, and the X percentage of that of disabilities will be worth an Y amount of shekels. Meaning that meaning that if he can prove more medical conditions that are recognized as connected to the Holocaust by the state, then he will get more compensation. And this is a very problematic situation, because what happened is that along the years, Holocaust survivors started to try to to victimize themselves even further by trying to connect more and more of their disabilities and their sufferings medically to the Holocaust. And what it means that they needed to come each time to the bureaucratic office in Israel and talk about what they've been through and re-traumatize the story and make themselves even more even more poor than and hurtful than they even felt. It became a bureaucratic game, and this is one of the biggest problems of this law. And before I go to, let's do the other example, and then I'll say another insight that I wanted to say. So let's take Leah. She came in 1954 from Germany, meaning she came 1 year after the Luxembourg Accords, so she could sue directly Germany, right? So she in 1956, oh, I'm sorry. So in 1956, she sued. But let's say she forgot. She didn't want to think about the Holocaust. So many people didn't even want to think about what's went on there and all that they've lost, so that they didn't want to even talk about compensations. Only 20 years after, in 1970 something, she began to digest what she's been through. And only then she started to think about suing for compensation. But as I said before, now, at that point in the 70s, she lost her right to do so. And the next time that the law opened for her, it was only in 1995. And it didn't pay retroactively. So this is another example. And I feel the need to say again that this table might be not 100% correct in each example, because each case is so different. But in the general sense, this is the situation. And another thing I want to say is that I understand if you think about the German interest, then you can imagine that a few years after being conquered and losing the war, they found themselves needed to compensate millions of people, not only Jews, and states. And for that reason, they built the law in a way that it's only compensations for people who've been under Nazi rule, not their allies. And it's only under medical disability that you prove. But so it's very minimizing because of the German economical interest. However, Israel decided to copy the same structure. And for a reason that I think that hurt eventually an unneeded act of copying the same structure, it eventually it imported the problem into Israel of survivors needing to prove and go through the bureaucracy and relive their trauma and so on. Okay, let's take another example. David. He came to Israel in 1951 from Czechoslovakia. he supposedly, because he came to Israel in 1951, he supposedly didn't have the right to sue. However, because he did not go through a ghetto or a camp, he hid in a pit or an attic for 2 years. He basically was not even eligible in the first place to get compensated. It took up to the 2000 years or so for the Israeli court to interpretate the Israeli law and broaden it so that also people who were not physically in a camp or a ghetto, but were, for example, hiding and suffering from, let's say, malnutrition, which is a classic case that will inflict the rest of your life, are also eligible for compensations. So what you see is that the Israeli courts have broadened the scope of people getting compensations along the year. And I want to get to the 3 most interesting examples that you see down here. Let's take Sonia, that she was in the Latvian ghetto and she came to Israel in 1977 from the USSR. So she had no eligibility till the 1990s. She also, because she came from the Eastern Bloc, which did not recognize Jews to be specifically inflicted by the Germans, they insisted that all citizens of the USSR were inflicted the same and suffered from persecution by the Nazis, and therefore she would have problems proving by documents that she didn't have that she were a survivor. The USSR did not easily give documents proving the existence, physical existence in these places back then. And this was also a very big problem for people who came from the Eastern Bloc. Bina came to Israel in 1992, part of the huge, vast wave of USSR Jewish immigrants into Israel after the fall of the USSR. She came to Israel in 1992, and she was a survivor from Babi Yar, from the Ukraine murder pits. And I don't know if how familiar you are with it, but Jews in the eastern part of the USSR part that was conquered by the Nazis, they were seldom sent to ghettos. Most of the times, they were simply gathered up outside their village and shot. And for that reason, it was harder for them to get compensated because the law compensated only people who were in ghettos or camps. And it took a lot of years for the legal system to understand that it needs to be fixed, this problem, because the suffering is the same. And the last example that I'm going to give you is of Miriam. She came to Israel in 1952 from Libya. And I don't know if you know, a lot of people don't know, but the Nazis and the Italians got also to North Africa. And they established there in Libya and Tunisia concentration camps. And a few thousand Jews survived these. A few thousand Jews were sent to these concentration camps, and a few thousand Jews survived. And also until around 2000, they were not eligible to get compensated. So what we see from this table is a mix that doesn't make a lot of sense of how people in Israel were being compensated for what, and you understand that the bureaucratic process is also very hurtful for people, and also doesn't give clearance for people on how they were gonna be compensated. Okay. So let's talk about the problems. So we've talked about the arbitrary discrimination between similar circumstance survivors. We talk about Israel copying the German law, which is a narrow recognition and re-traumatizing the tragedy. And we've talked about how the legal framing of the law doesn't fit the Holocaust of the USSR Jews. You see here a map of the USSR where you see the arrows. This is the part where the Nazis, when they occupied the USSR parts of the, when they conquered some of the parts of the USSR, Western parts like Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, you see how the Einsatzgruppen groups, which were groups of soldiers who came with the soldiers, but they were intended to kill Jews solely, how they worked. I'm not going to elaborate about it more because it's we can talk about it for hours. But the laws compensating Jews were not built, not by the Germans and then later on by the Israelis, were not built for survivors from this part. And most of these people will also, it took them time to come to Israel. They were blocked in the Eastern Bloc, that they didn't even have the chance to sue. Okay, let's move on. So let's talk about some principles or moral questions, and maybe the first of which will be, who is a survivor? And what happened is that the legal frame, people who were being acknowledged as survivors for legal reasons were people who believed they are survivors, and people who were not recognized, they felt like, maybe I'm not a survivor. So who is a survivor? So let's take a person who lost everything, his family and property, but he managed to escape without being sent into a camp or ghetto or hide. He managed to escape, let's say, on a train a day before Odessa in Ukraine was conquered into the USSR. He lost everything. Basically, I will say he's a survivor, but looking at the table before, he will not be eligible for any compensation. And this was the situation up to 2014, and this is what I want to talk about next. So in the 1990s, about 1 million Jews emigrated from the USSR to Israel when the Soviet Union fell. Another amount emigrated to America. And maybe you know some people around your area who came to America after the fall of the USSR. But Israel absorbed that Israel back then was about, I think, 6 million people, maybe even less, and it absorbed about 1 million, up to 1.5 million immigrants from the USSR, who were Jews mostly. And a big part of them were elder people that lived throughout the years of the war. And they came to Israel at a very old age, not a very old age, but let's say 50 or 60, 70. And they did not speak Hebrew. They could not go to work, and they lost all their pensions when the USSR fell, because the state promised them throughout the years that it will take care of them when they'll be old. But because the system didn't work and communism didn't work there, at least, they understood that in 1989 and 1991, when it finally fell, that they have no savings for their last days. So they came to Israel, and basically this population of elder people, a vast population of elder people, became the welfare population. They lived basically on welfare stipends. And they could not go to work because they didn't talk the language, and they did not have kids that could help them because their kids were immigrants themselves. And this was the situation in Israel for basically the past 30 years. And there's a question, are there survivors? So if one of them, of these group, of people of this group, was a survivor on a pit, like a killing pit, then it would be easiest for us to say he's a survivor. But as I explained before, like my two grandmothers, if they managed to escape a day before, they lost all their families and properties, but they did manage to escape a day before. I think that's that's the definition of a survivor. They survive, but not by the law and not by the Russians. And my grandmothers never even thought about themselves as survivors because they haven't been through the ghettos and such. However, in 2014, Yair Lapid, who's the head of the current opposition, and he's the previous prime minister of Israel, decided to include this group of about 80,000 USSR Olim, elder people, into the law, making them from poor people to survivors. And what happened is that once they became legally a survivor, they were eligible to demand and sue for damage. They were not, they got the opportunity to receive money from the state, not for being poor, but for being a survivor. However, it was only a yearly, and up to today, it's only a yearly compensation of about $1,600. It's not a lot of money, and they get the social benefits and that the survivors receive. And this $1,600, it's about 15 times lower than the previous survivors that I've described in the previous table. However, they are the poorest survivors. And this is something that is very important to understand, that in current day Israel, the poorest survivors, which is this group, receives the least amount of compensations from the state. And this has a lot to do with politics, because even though we can say it doesn't make any sense, people who went through the extermination camps and ghettos will say, well, they aren't really survivors, or at least they're not survivors like us, and it should be inflicted on the amount of money that they get. And this arises the question of whether compensations should be based on damage or based on need. And one of the things that I think, when the average age of Holocaust survivors is 85, is that now is the time for Israel to move its law for compensations for survivors from damage-based to need-based. Because in current situation, it means that a ghetto survivor who came to Israel in 1950s and became a CEO of a corporate, and he is very rich, he receives very big amounts of reparations and compensations for his history, unlike a very poor person who did not go through the ghetto. But it's an open question. Like, I can understand a person that would say both ways. I have a few minutes more, but I'm going to wrap it up soon. And I think that we can also talk about conflicting that, because of what I said, you see that in the politics of Holocaust survivors, with the NGOs representing different types of survivors, you almost don't see organizations that represent the USSR-born survivors, mainly because there were no NGOs in the Soviet Union, because it was all taken care of by the states. And however, from my perspective as somebody who worked in the government, I'm not sure that the broad NGOs that take care of all the survivors really see these survivors as real survivors. And for that reason, I sometimes felt that they do not really promote the interests of the poor survivors. And they will never agree with me, but this is my personal view. So 2 minutes, last minutes, about social care and poverty. So out of 140,000 survivors living in Israel today, roughly 30 to 40% are poor. And 90% of, approximately, It's not exact numbers. There are exact numbers, but roughly. And the majority of these 30 to 40% of poor Holocaust survivors are the previous group that I talked about that receive a yearly compensation and not a monthly compensation. Social benefits, they receive from the state major discounts on bills and meds. They receive social and mental care from state-funded and executed by NGOs. The state participates in nursing and private medical care. And there are NGOs that help them from philanthropic funds. However, I have some criticism about these NGOs. In Israel, I would say that helping Holocaust survivor is the most popular way of volunteering. It's the most consensual. A lot of NGOs, but I think that they don't dive in to the needs. So I'll just give you one example. I met an NGO that helps to furnish and renovate survivor houses. However, they did not take into account that the survivors who need the most their help live in public housing or live in state-owned elder people, that they have no right even to renovate. It's not their place. So what happened is that basically they found themselves helping survivors that when their need is not financial, maybe it's mental, but it's not a financial help that they need. They can furnish their house, renovate their house on their own for that. That's just one example for unprofessional, good-hearted assistance. Solutions, and that's it. The first one, I think we should change the compensation structure from damage-based to need-based. But I can definitely understand people who will say, no, the Holocaust is a damaged thing. It's not, poor people should be helped by by the welfare, and not by them including them into the bank of definition of Holocaust survivors. The second thing is, I think that there are funds to help these people, and the funds come from deceased Holocaust survivors that the state stops paying for them. So instead of the current situation when the state of Israel and also Germany saves money each year more and more because there are less and less survivors, they can use the same money and give it on the base of need. That's another solution. Another solution is for the state to do language and cultural accessibility to social services. For example, Russian people or Russian origin survivors, but not only survivors, they don't see mental health as something which is a legitimate thing. So they simply don't use it. And then they get into depression. And then they stop cooking and they stop cleaning their house. And this is how we get to the pictures that we see on each Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel in the media of how is it possible that we are still seeing these pictures. 4 and 5, NGOs impact-based philanthropism. This is what I've just said before. And the last thing, political stability. When the Israeli government changes every year, there's no possibility to do long-term plans in anything. And I can say it about any topic. But as somebody who worked in the government, I can tell you that we had even knowing that we need to change the compensation structure, which is a mega process, we knew there's no way of doing it because the government is probably going to fall in a few months. So let's grab what we can and do small steps. So this is the biggest problem I think that Israel faces right now. Well, it has bigger problems, and I talk about that as well, but on this aspect. Before handing it back, I'll say that I invite you to stay in touch with me via my website, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and on my homepage, you can see other talks that I give, mostly now about the Israeli constitutional crisis. But we can talk about it later. I think now we can take it to Q&A.
Hi. Nimrod, thank you so much. I am Esther. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. Nimrod, thank you for your fantastic talk. It is above and beyond complicated, what you have described, for sure. And we are receiving questions from the audience, so I'm going to start you off, and then please keep sending to myself the questions, or you can direct it to the entire group if you like, and we'll get through them. So the first question comes from Beth. Beth is asking, how many people did end up suing Germany directly? So those who opted out of the settlements, I should say, is what the question is regarding. And then did Germany ever change their eligibility criteria the way that Israel has done when it adopted those laws?
Okay, so I don't have specific numbers. I can tell you that nowadays, most of the Holocaust survivors receive their compensations from Israel because Israel kept broadening the eligibility, unlike Germany. And another thing is that Germany also still passes big amounts of funds to Israel to pass it on to survivors. So it's complex in itself. What is the amount of the people? I'm not sure, but I know today that most of the people are receiving it from Israel.
Okay.
And another question?
Yes. Right? So also from Beth, is claims conference only them working with survivors outside of Israel?
Yes, the answer is yes. Sometimes the claim conference, for example, definitely participates, for example, with the Israeli state in some of the services given to Holocaust survivors inside Israel, but it doesn't work directly with Holocaust survivors in Israel, at least from what I know, and I think that I have a good concept of that. Right?
Yeah, I think that's correct, because I worked at the claims conference for many years, and I think you're right that it's everybody but Israelis who are through there. So you were referring to the fact that now is the time to switch to a need-based compensation, given that I'm assuming that the funds are still enough to compensate everybody and do so. What happens to the funds? Do you know? If there's any leftover, is there any concept of what will happen? Who will benefit from it? Is it going to go to second generation? Is it going to go to educational purposes? Do you know?
Yes. So what we are seeing now, it's a part of the answer. What we're seeing now is that the world, not only Israel, is starting to talk more and more about commemoration, and more about second generation, meaning that, for example, the question is, how will we prevent people from forgetting? And when we want to talk about that, we need to put funds into it. And so you see more and more funds going into that. However, we always say it couldn't be instead. So it's always a question of when there is spare money, how do you implement it? And working in the government, I had a few times that suddenly the finance ministry said, okay, there is 20 million shekels. How can you, what professionally do you think should be done? And I wasn't the prerogative to decide. There are people inside the ministry who are way more knowledgeable than I, but I'm also knowledgeable on the topic. And it was always a problem, because when the group is so big, 80,000 people, 100,000 people, 140,000, is very big. Then when you split it up, it's not that big amount of money that you can give them. So we tried to do, for example, maybe to use these money to give more discount in electricity, for example, and stuff like that. I can say that 2 years ago, the previous government And the minister that I worked with, her name is Nimrod Gornstein. She managed to gain a very, I think about 500 million shekels, which is, I would say, about $150 million, something like that, to enlarge the amount of compensation given for the yearly survivors, who are the poor survivors, and it enlarged it in like 1,000 shekels, which is like 400 euros per dollars per person.
Very interesting. Thank you. Robert is asking no compensation to families for loss of life. So I'm guessing this would be like somebody who was widowed, or lost somebody, a child, a parent, a spouse.
Nothing. Yes. Nothing. Nothing. And this is basically what I try to say, that people lost all their families and property, and they are not being considered as survivors. And this is the question of who is a survivor. That's the biggest question of this talk. And I'll say in this context as well that I didn't say that we didn't talk about compensation, reparations for property, compensated, stolen. It's a different material. It's a different legal material. Some people managed to get their property, some not. If you were in the Eastern Bloc, it was harder, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So now, now that I understand better from you that there was kind of like a hierarchy of suffering through this legal framework set up, how did that affect the survivor community itself? If your neighbor, like you were saying, your neighbors might be having had granted a different experience during the Holocaust, but yet is receiving a very different amount of money. So how did that, affect survival relationships among the community?
So I think it's an interesting question that I need to read more about the sociological and aspects of it. But I can think about two results. One is that people didn't talk about the money they get. This is one. And two, which I saw more with the Russian immigrants, that they did talk about it because they tried to understand the bureaucracy. So, and not only the Russians, but none of the survivors really understood how does the system work. Nobody, not even them. Their kids didn't understand. The professionals didn't understand. Nobody up to this day understand. The problem is getting smaller and smaller because people are dying, unfortunately. But it's like, as you saw, it's like the legal material is like a patch built. There's no organizing concept of how to do it. And Israel never organized it. It just copied the German structure, but felt moral obligation to broaden it. And the result was a very problematic structure.
Yeah. So, all the struggles that Israel and Germany has experienced with figuring out the most ethical way, do you know of any other international communities, countries, right, who have done right by compensating Holocaust survivors?
Yes, so I can give you an example. 2 years ago, the Romanian government decided to compensate for lost pensions. Some of the survivors who were in Romania, and it was a political it was a political act, but suddenly a few hundred Romanian survivors started trying to understand. They heard something that the Romanian government is starting to compensate for this reason of lost pensions, and then they started and they again lost themselves in bureaucracy, and I'm not sure what's happening today with that, but each time you have a group, I'll give you another example. The Leningrad blockade survivors, okay, who were living for like 4 years in a blockade and starvation. It was horrible what happened in Leningrad throughout the Second World War. And they weren't in a ghetto, they were not in a camp, but the state did decide eventually to include them. These people are now like 90 something, or for example, another law compensate for participation in armies. So if you were a soldier in the Red Army and you survived and you're in Israel, you'll be compensated. It's also a bit different, but so you asked about other countries. So I gave the example of Romania, and I know that also other countries have done so. I'm not familiar with a specific example, so I'm just gonna say that.
In Hungary, my grandparents received basically compensation from the Hungarian government for slave labor, for these labor camps that they had to. It was so minimal, but it was actually negotiated, I think in the 1970s. It was minimal, and this was towards like the end of the communist era.
Exactly,
but it was
and
just something.
I can say in that context that another interesting question, which is an impossible question when you mix such a historical tragedy with law and regulations, is that how do you how can you calculate the damage? How can you how can you calculate the suffering of a person that has been through a ghetto or has been through a concentration camp? And basically, there's no answer. The answer was how much money can somebody give, and that was and how much political pressure did somebody put on him to get more money. So it all ends up in politics, and it's also the diplomatic relations between Israel and Germany, because the more Germany participates in the Israeli effort to compensate, then it's less money the finance ministry in Israel needs to do it. So these are the dynamics of diplomatic relations between Germany and Israel in the context of Holocaust compensations up to today. And Israel is constantly trying to, and I'm perfectly fine with that, but is constantly in trying in diplomatic ways to get more and more funds for the survivors. The only question is whether it adds or whether it gives less because the German give more. You understand what I'm saying? So
Say this last bit again. This last.
I'm saying that it's great when Israel in diplomatic means manages to get to an agreement, and it happens also nowadays, an agreement with Germany to enlarge the compensation that it passes to Israel, that it passes to survivors. There is still a question. Does Israel save the money and keeps the amount the same, or does it enlarge the money to a bigger amount? And any finance ministry in each country that does its job tries or aspires to save money.
Of course.
And there's a conflict of interest when the finance ministry is the one that deals with such a thing as a compensation for survivors. And the last thing I'm going to say is that you should know that up to 2 years ago, the unit that dealt with Holocaust survivors in Israel was sitting in the finance ministry. So it was a conflict of interest inside the finance ministry that you always try to save money. But this is a materia which is welfare. You need to give money. And that's another interesting thing.
Well, that's right there, a moral dilemma. That's
Yes.
not. But thank you so much. I think we learned a lot. You gave us a lot to think about. I want to thank everybody who joined today. There was a lot of us. We are also going to put this recording on our social media and websites and so forth. Thanks again for everybody for joining at Nimrod. This was terrific and we learned a lot. So,
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll finish by saying that this is also a complex time in Israel, as you know. And I think that if it's a good time to also be knowledgeable about what's going on here, also in these aspects, because it is historical time. It's again historical time, I would say, for the Jewish nation as a whole, this time in the Israeli context. But thank you for inviting me in this context, and I hope it was interesting for you and that you've
it was
learned
very interesting and very informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.